Hello and welcome again to another plus-size kite review. In this episode, I'll be focusing on the awesome new 2024 Cabrinha Nitro, the second edition of one of my favorite kites of last year, while riding it against two other personal favorites, the Orbit Pro and the Evo D-Lab. To make this video even more spicy, I've been wearing two Apple Watches so that I can do a moderately accurate comparison of the two most popular session measuring apps, Woo and Surfr. But before we get to the review, a quick update as always on my never-ending journey to find different kites to throw some angry loops with. So far this year, I've already hit up a number of brands to propose my plans for 2024, as mentioned on my Instagram, and a little bit in my last video where I covered the epic Fly Surfer era. Definitely worth watching if you haven't seen it yet. Each of the brands I've hit up have shown some interest, and I've already gotten my hands on a Harlem Force to profile as soon as we start getting some more big winds down here in New Zealand. Hopefully this will open up a few more avenues for gear testing later this year, and I'll just keep updating my progress between reviews on Instagram as usual. This is all being made possible by you guys for watching, sharing, and commenting on these videos. If it wasn't for the engagement they've been getting, I would have stopped after the first one, to be honest. So I can't thank you all enough, but please, as always, be sure to like and comment on what kites you would like to see and what you'd like to know about them. And if you can be bothered, subscribe to my channel and share this video with your kiting friends. For those of you who might be stumbling onto this video having not seen any of my other reviews, I should first mention as always that each video is an ongoing continuation from the last of the series, almost like a conversation. So I would suggest you watch the previous ones, particularly the video on the Cabrinha Nitro, the previous model, so you don't miss any of the general thoughts on this kite that I covered in that video. But there's also obviously a lot that will apply to this kite as well. So on to the 2024 model. First off, you may notice that I'm riding a color scheme that is a bit different to the one from the release video. This is something they call the Wildcard series, and I think it's kind of a cool idea from Cabrinha to make use of excess fabric to make a few limited edition versions of their kites. Perhaps it's a marketing gimmick, I don't really know, but I like the idea of not wasting perfectly glued fabric, and I think this kite looks bloody sharp, so I'm all for it really. I also quite like it when brands have a few versions of each model in terms of color, mainly just because I like having different colors for each size myself, and I also like it when my friends do, so that if I go to a spot and they're already out on the water, I instantly know what size they're on. Now that we're ready to discuss riding the kite, I'll quickly recap my thoughts on the previous model. Basically, it's a very close cousin to the North Orbit, which at the time I compared to the 2023 Orbit. Which is no surprise because it was designed by Pat Goodman, the original designer of the Orbit. The main differences I found between the kites were that the Nitro was a little bit friskier, had slightly more lift, but once you get over around the 30 to 35 knot mark, it lost a good amount of its stability and got pretty challenging to ride with confidence. In summary, I said I think I preferred the Nitro slightly to the Orbit under 30 knots, but I preferred the Orbit in over 30 knots. Either way, it was pretty close. When looking at this kite, it would appear that Cabrinha shared my feelings with the high wind performance, because right off the bat you can see they have added additional attachment points for the 2024 model's bridle, which now has 7 points like my Evo D-Lab. But did this work, you'd have to ask? And the answer appears to be yes, very much so. I've ridden it over multiple sessions now, but the main one I'll be describing at first was only about 25 to 30 knots. So I just got to have a good play and get really comfortable on the kite. Right off the bat, I felt good control, looping either direction, threw out one of the bigger boogie loops I've ever done, as you can see here, and just generally was feeling super confident on the water and thus great about my life on the kite. The old feeling I've had for years when I've ridden the various 9-meter orbits I've owned. But something was just a little bit different here. The kite felt noticeably faster than your standard 2024 Orbit or the previous variants, but with the same level of control. And as a bonus, the loops starting to feel even closer in speed to how I remembered the Orbit Pro, the fastest version of the Orbit of them all. I always knew where it was, seemed to find the sweet spot when sending it for jumps fairly easily, and had no trouble looping it at different heights without fear of it not flying up to catch me. Needless to say, so far so good. I was really enjoying the kite. And after 45 minutes, I came in and swapped to the North Orbit Pro for perspective, because it's always super challenging to make detailed calls about kites when you are not riding them in the same wind at the same spot. Now, if you've seen my last video on the Orbit Pro, you'll remember it is quite a challenging ride and takes some getting used to because it's designed for pros and competition riding. Once again, I struggled with the timing of it a bit, found myself over-sending it a few times and doing some less than clean heli loops. The wind was also starting to creep up, however, when I swapped kites, at least another 5 knots in the gust, and the more it did, the more I struggled to get adapted back to the Pro. Now, I know from my previous sessions on it that you do eventually get used to it, and it is just magic when you do and start to feel comfortable. But I was actually pretty eager to jump back on the Nitro again on this particular day, perhaps because it was getting a bit gusty, but if I'm being honest, it just felt like the kite was a lot friendlier, and also because it was time to find out how much they've done to improve the top ending performance now that the wind was picking up more. So after 45 minutes, it was time to swap back to the Nitro, and this time we also did a bar swap, so I could ride it on the north bar to see if there was any differences there. The first thing that surprised me with either kite on the north bar is that I felt like the north bar was a little less direct and had a slightly more spongy feel. So I can only assume this was from the lines, or a significant change in the wind range, getting at least 5 knots windier in the gust after that first kite swap, but still keeping around the 25 to 30 knot average. Now, the Cabrinha bar was brand new, but this north bar is my wife's bar that has less than 10 hours on it, and she weighs half of what I do and rides in lighter conditions, so it's basically new as well. I have been told by another friend of mine who replaced his north lines with lines from the Linesmith that he noticed the lines being more responsive, but it would have been a few weeks between uses, so I didn't take much note of it. But as I said, with my case, the wind had gotten a lot stronger between sessions and swapping bars, so I can't say for sure there is much difference as I was feeling, but it's certainly something I'm going to be looking for with testing these kites more and doing a few more bar swaps. I doubt I'll make a whole video on this, but if you are curious about my findings, you should follow my Instagram. On this day of testing in particular, I preferred the feel of the Cabrinha bar just for this reason alone. One other key point I've been noticing more and more is that once you've been riding a lighter bar like my duotone truss bars, it is a bit annoying going back to the more robust, heavier bars like the Cabrinha or North bar when you're riding bigger conditions with small, faster kites. I believe I mentioned in my last Nitro review that I think I prefer the heavier bars with bigger kites, but as the wind gets stronger and the kites get smaller, I find that the lighter bar means you have a more balanced sensitivity when controlling the lighter, faster kites. If you are used to heavier bars like I used to be, then the lighter bars might be annoying, of course. I think it makes a bit of sense that as these kites and materials continue to get lighter and faster, so should the bars every few years. But then of course you risk the reality that you can only make a bar so light before you start having issues with durability, because both my Core Sensor 3 Pro bar and my duotone truss bars have areas on them that need regular part replacement, particularly around the center lines, whereas my North bars have never needed any pieces replacing, and on this Cabrinha bar they have a fairly robust ceramic piece in the middle that, although I don't like the feel of it in cold sessions, it makes a lot of sense now to have it there, as that is a significant area of wear on those other bars that have auto unwind features. Now, back on the Nitro, the wind was really cranking, so it was woosting and big loops time, and I had an absolute blast. The kite handles the stronger stuff so much better than its predecessor, and for someone my level, better than the Orbit Pro as well. I'd wager the Orbit Pro has an edge on this Nitro for top-end performance, at least for things like double loops, but my smallest kite is only an 8, so that's not really a realm I'm caring about. And that makes sense because the Orbit was designed for pro-level comp riding. I managed to crack 20 meters a few times on the woo, which is a great indication of the wind being over 35 knots, but I never really felt too overpowered on the 9. And mega loops in the 13 to 16 meter range felt super easy to control. The yank was there when I did my best to pull earlier and slow the kite down some, but by default when you crank that bar at any height, the kite tends to loop high and tight and shoots back up to catch you with lightning speed. So even if you don't cheat the bar out with quite the right timing or kite position, it does a good job as anything at catching you by putting the kite in a really safe position for you. Overall, the most accurate comparison I think I could give this kite is near orbit pro speed with probably even more than standard orbit stability, which for my level is the most winning combination for loop progression that I think I can find in any Dacron kite I've tested. In terms of boosting, I would say this version might be marginally better than the previous model because it feels a touch lighter, but that's a tough call to say without riding them back to back. So I would still put it behind kites like the recently tested Fly Surfr Era or classic boosters like the XR or the Edge. Where this kite shines the most by far is the looping and confidence building. My two favorite factors in kites really, which probably makes this my current favorite Dacron kite and probably my favorite overall bigger progression kite. Now I'm not going to pretend it is a contender for the overall performance of my Evo D-Labs, although I find the looping in particular a bit friendlier and easier to control, but you shouldn't expect it to have the same level of overall performance as a top-end Alula kite that costs 25% more. The good news for me is, we all know from watching their team rider Stino in King of the Air that Cabrinha are working on an Alula something or other, which, based on how magical this kite is, I'm really excited about. To give you some performance context of this versus the D-Lab, I took out my 8-meter D-Lab in the same conditions I was riding the 9-meter Nitro and starting jumping on average the same heights, with my highest woost being 2.5 meters higher. But because I was on a smaller kite with the D-Lab, the gusts were less severe and the overall session became a bit easier because of the reduced weight on the bar and the quick maneuverability. I think the D-Lab's design also has a play in that as well. Keep in mind though, if you are not used to the increased performance, you might not necessarily benefit from it without some practice, and may in fact find yourself going backwards in your confidence on the water because of the power and speed of the kite, like I was with the Orbit Pro earlier today. But that pretty much sums up my experiences so far on the kite. What I will be doing next is holding on to this for some time until I have a few more brands to ride against it later in this year. And then I will ride them all in the same locations, in the same conditions, and hopefully find out what is the best Dacron, what is the best Alula, what's the best for loops, for boosts, and around the time of the Woo Worlds, release my videos with the highest in each category and best overall for 2024. Speaking of Woo, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have been putting together a comparison video of my thoughts on the Woo versus Surfr apps. But darned it if those SpaceX boys didn't just do a fantastic video of their own and release it this morning while I was still editing mine. I'll put a link to it in the descriptions. And I think I'll save my edit for now, but if you would like to see it, just comment below and I'll finish making it. I do have a few different opinions to them, and I found some points they didn't touch on, but overall theirs is very high quality and definitely worth your time, as is all of their content. So that finishes up this review. Like with all my kite videos, if there is anything I didn't cover, please comment below and I will respond, but also try to address it in the future videos or on my Instagram. Please also make sure to check out and subscribe to all the brands and other content creators that I have mentioned in this video, because they all do amazing work. Thanks for making it all the way to the end, and stay tuned for my next video either on the Woo comparison or on the Harlem Force. Goodbye!